The Decades of Henry Bullinger, 1504 to 1575. Minister of the Church of Zurich. Biographical notice of Henry Bullinger. Henry Bullinger, the fifth child of Henry Bullinger and Anna Whitaker, was born on the 18th of July, 1504, at Bremgarten, a small town, of which his father was parish priest and dean, about 10 miles west of Zurich. In his childhood he was preserved several times from imminent perils, once from the plague and risk of premature interment, again, when by a fall in the street, a whistle which was in his hand was driven into his neck, and again, when the enticement of a beggar would have stolen him from his home and friends. His earliest education was commenced in his 5th year in the school of his native place, but such was his fondness for learning, application, and forwardness, that in his 12th year, June 11, 1516, his father sent him to a grammar school at Emmerich on the Rhine. There he continued 3 years, and made rapid advances, especially in his Latin studies. Meanwhile his pecuniary resources were kept so straitened, that he was obliged to beg for a livelihood from one neighbor's door to another, with singing. This severe discipline his father exercised, not out of necessity, nor from covetousness, but, as he thought, to train his son to moderation in his own habits, and to sympathy with the sufferings of the poor. Nor was this hardship, connected as it was with the superstitious notions of his day, uncongenial with young Bullinger's own temperament. Rather he has left it on record, that he already purposed with himself to become a Carthusian monk after a few years, because it was the most strict of all the orders. From Emmerich, Bullinger was removed to the University of Cologne, and entered July 8, 1519, at the College Bersimontis. There the works of the school divines, and chiefly of Peter Lombard and Gratian, soon engrossed his attention, and in the providence of God, were converted into instruments for detaching him from the religion of Rome. For in this course of reading, meeting with frequent extracts from the Fathers, he felt an earnest desire quickened within him to peruse their entire writings. Accordingly, he solicited and obtained admission to a well-stored library of the Dominicans, and there he studied with intense ardor several treatises of Chrysostom, Ambrose, Origen, and Augustine. Simultaneously the earlier tracts of Luther, especially his Babylonish Captivity and treatise on Christian liberty, with the loci communes of Melanchthon, came into his hands. He also procured for himself a copy of the New Testament, and devoted days and nights to the perusal of it, with the aid of the commentaries of Jerome. The result of these pursuits was that Bullinger's mind and heart opened gradually to the knowledge and reception of the gospel in its purity. In this transition state, and having taken his bachelor's degree in October 1520, and his master's in February 1522, Bullinger returned in April of that year to his father's roof at Bremgarten. There he devoted himself to the study of the Bible with still greater eagerness, and joined to it the writings of Athanasius, Cyprian, and Lactantius, and several of Luther's treatises, especially on the abrogation of the Mass, and on vows. These occupations powerfully promoted, under God, his improved views of Christian truth. But his profiting was not to be for himself only. The Cistercian abbot of Kappel, Wolfgang Joner, since his elevation in 1519, had labored much to improve the moral and intellectual condition of his convent. Having heard therefore of Bullinger's excellent character, studiousness, and abilities, he sent an invitation to him early in 1523, to become lecturer and teacher of the monks and other students in his monastery, and as the offer was disconnected with any constraint of vows, profession, or observances, that could interfere with his enlightened conscience, Bullinger consented to enter, January 17, upon the proposed duties. The engagement, however, was a further development of God's gracious providence toward him, and as it allowed him to discourse on the Holy Scriptures, with the writings of the Fathers and Erasmus and Melanchthon. It was a signal means to himself and his hearers of advancement in sound Christian doctrine, notwithstanding severe oppositions even to the risk of life. 6 years were passed by Bullinger in this useful retirement. There he also composed, principally for his own practice and improvement, more than 50 treatises, mostly on religious topics, the larger part of which remained in manuscript, but some were either published afterwards, or incorporated in his later writings, or distributed among his friends. During the same interval, Bullinger formed an intimate acquaintance with Zwingli and Leo Judi, and was much influenced by the religious sentiments of the former, especially on the subject of the Eucharist. Indeed, in the end of June 1527, he obtained from his abbot a leave of absence for 5 months to attend Zwingli's lectures at Zurich, where also Ho availed himself of the opportunity to perfect his acquaintance with Hebrew and Greek literature. In December of the same year, the Senate of Zurich deputed Bullinger to accompany Zwingli to the important disputation at Bern. On his return he was prevailed on to undertake the pastoral office, and preached his first sermon on Sunday, June 21, 1528, at the village of Husen, near Kappel. A new sphere of usefulness now opened on Bullinger, and yielding to the advice of his relatives and patron, and to the solicitations of the inhabitants, he went back to Bremgarten June 1, 1529, and by incessant preachings and expositions there and in neighboring places, greatly furthered the spreading cause of the Reformation. On the 17th of August he was united in marriage in the church of Bermensdorf, a small village near Bremgarten, by his brother John, the curé, to an Adlerschweiler, to whom he had been pledged during his visit to Zurich 2 years previously, and who had formerly been a nun in the convent of Ottenbach, where daughters of the first families in Zurich were received. During the 2 years of this residence at Bremgarten, Bullinger composed some of his commentaries on parts of Holy Scripture. He often disputed in public and largely wrote against the prevailing errors of the Anabaptists. In consequence of the disastrous defeat of the Protestant Confederates at Kappel, October 11, 1531, Bullinger was compelled to remove with his family and parents into Zurich for safety. There he settled on the 21st of November, and on the 9th of December following, at the same time that the Senate of Bâle applied for him as successor to Œcolampadius, and the Senate of Bern solicited him for a pastor, he was appointed by the authorities of Zurich to supply the vacancy in the preachership of their cathedral, which had been created by the melancholy death of Zwingli. Bullinger continued in this important post for the remainder of his long life, laboring with most assiduous diligence and widespread influence. For several years, from 1531 to 1538, his preachings were daily, sometimes twice in the day. His publications, of which many were suggested by passing events, were voluminous and frequent, his pastoral and synodical, civil and ecclesiastical engagements were unceasing and very various. His correspondence was exceedingly extensive and critical, and his house was always open and his interpositions ready to shelter and befriend especially refugees from every country where religious persecution raged. And during the protracted efforts to effect a reconciliation between the Lutherans and the Church of Zurich on the sacramentarian question, his moderation and sincerity were eminently conspicuous. In the middle of January 1536, Bullinger was deputed with Leo Judi to attend the conference of deputies from all the Swiss Reformed churches at Bâle. There he assisted in drawing up the first Helvetic Confession of Faith, and commenced a personal acquaintance with Calvin. His hospitalities also were liberally experienced at Zurich by Englishmen, John Butler, Nicholas Partridge, and William Woodruff, in the month of August of the same year. Bartholomew Traherne joined them in September of the following year. A fatal plague in 1541 deprived Bullinger of his aged mother, August 16, and one of his sons, September 30, and in the next year, of his beloved colleague Leo Judi, June 19, in the midst of his invaluable labors on Biblia Tigurina. The preface to this translation, which Bibliander had principally completed, was written by Bullinger in February 1543. In his extant diary, Bullinger has marked March 29, 1547, as the day when Hooper and his wife, in their exile, accomplished their long-cherished desire of visiting him, and March 24, 1549, when they left him for England with their daughter Rachel, his godchild. In the end of May of that year, Calvin and Farel also came to Bullinger, and a consensus or agreement was completed on the subject of the Lord's Supper between the churches of Geneva and Zurich. At the same instant, as appeared by various decrees in the following year, the whole weight of the papal party, imperial and ecclesiastical, was combining to condemn Bullinger and all his writings. But nothing turned him aside from his steady course of usefulness, and early in 1554 the largest influx of English refugees enjoyed his sympathy and interest. Among them were Parkhurst, Jewell, Horne, Pilkington, Lever, Humphrey, and Cole. Italian exiles from Locarno also sought and obtained like shelter in Zurich, through his interventions, in the spring of the following year. From 1556 to 1564 Bullinger's time and exertions were largely and painfully consumed in combating the errors of Jehoiakim Westphalus, Stancheri, George Blandrata, Brenthes, and Aachen. While in the last mentioned year, a pestilence deprived him of his wife, and his second daughter, married to Lavater, and in the following year, of two other daughters his eldest, the wife of Zwingli Dot, and his third, who had married Josiah Simler. By the same plague, he had himself also been brought to the brink of the grave, and not long after his sufferings. From the stone commenced, which embittered the remainder of his days. Notwithstanding his declining health, family bereavements, and public trials, however, Bullinger's manifold labors continued unabated. And in the year 1571, he exerted himself most indefatigably in relieving his destitute country people during a very grievous famine. Early in October 1574, his last and fatal disorder attacked him. In the first instance, indeed, the severity of the seizure yielded so far to the remedies that were applied, that he was able to resume his public duties. But the disease returned on the 24th of May in the following year, with excruciating violence, and lasted until the 17th of September, when, after exhibiting a bright example of Christian patience, and having taken a touching personal farewell of all his colleagues, and written a letter to the Senate of Zurich, to be delivered after his decease, one object of which was to commend to them Rodolph Gulter as his successor, he expired. In the exercise of much prayer, and in the peace of the gospel, in the 71st year of his age. His remains were deposited in the Cathedral of Zurich, amid the sincere and living regrets of all classes of his townspeople.